Okay, back again. Okay, I'm going to try and cover these wars, but also, if I can, I'd like to also throw in religion, the Great Awakening. But and in order to keep this short, I'm probably going to link a separate video to the French and Indian War, a little short video I just found. But I'm going to talk about it a little bit as well. Okay, I don't have my maps. I really like to use my maps to talk about the French and Indian War. Without looking at maps, it's kind of hard to see what we're, conceptualize this. I like using my maps. All right, wars. Wars help bring people together. Think about after 9/11 and how everybody put American flags on everything after the 9/11 attacks. Up until the ill-fated invasion of Iraq, the war on terror really brought Americans together. All right, so wars start bringing the colonists together, starting with King William's War. The colonists are going to get dragged into wars that England fights with its enemies in Europe. Because most of these wars start in Europe and are over things, European politics, for the most part, the colonists themselves don't care or really don't understand some of the politics of what's going on in Europe. They just name the wars after who's the king. So there's going to be King William's War. Which is not insubstantial. 1687 to 1697, a 10-year-long war, which is ironic because in Europe it's called the 9 Years' War. I'll put that in parentheses. Another war, Queen Anne's War. There were a couple of other minor wars I'm not going to put on here. These are the big ones, though. Queen Anne's War. Again, Queen Anne is William and Mary. William, Duke of Orange, becomes King of England after the Glorious Revolution. He engages in a war with major European powers that ends up leading to the English and the French and the Spanish fighting in the colonies. Of course, dates in here, right? This is going to be one of the reasons why, the English are interested in the Carolinas. Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. So another 9-year-long war. This is, in Europe, the War of the Spanish Succession. So much of the war is fought in Europe over who the next king of Spain is going to be. But because England, France, and Spain all have colonies in the Americas, they fight a lot in the Americas. I'd have to double check, but I think it's during Queen Anne's War that England stole Jamaica from the French. That or it's during King George's War. This one's a little bit shorter, 4 years, 1744 to 48. Yeah, it's during this war because Lawrence Washington, George Washington's older brother, or oldest brother, George Washington was the youngest of 7 sons by his father's second wife. So George Washington inherited virtually nothing from his dad except for the family name. But Washington's oldest brother, Lawrence, who he idolized, was able to gain political prominence in Virginia by serving in a Virginia militia unit that was dispatched to support English regulars in the war King George's War, fought in Jamaica. So a lot of this fighting is going to be in the Caribbean as well as the frontier of North America. Of course, the biggest one is going to be the French and Indian War. Which is called the 7 Years' War in Europe. And unlike these other wars, the French and Indian War starts in America, almost single-handedly by George Washington. So the English and the French both claimed lands west of the Appalachians, the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley. When Queen Elizabeth had chartered Virginia for Sir Walter Raleigh, England claimed all of the land from Spanish Florida to the Hudson River Valley, all the way to the Pacific. And something we'll talk about later is the way in which many of these later colonies all have overlapping land claims, or many have overlapping land claims west of the Appalachians. So Virginia claimed the Ohio River Valley. But the French claimed all of the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Valley, as well as the Ohio River Valley. So the French sent in troops under the Marquis de Caen into the Ohio River Valley to drive English settlers out. English settlers had already started to move into what's now western Pennsylvania, the Scotch-Irish, and also into what's now West Virginia and northern Tennessee, or kind of northeastern Tennessee. So the French went in to drive these English settlers out. The governor of Virginia, Governor Dinwiddie, I cannot make that name up, that is a real name, sent in a young militia young militia lieutenant, George Washington, youngest of 7 sons, who was very politically ambitious, wanted to follow in his brother Lawrence's footsteps, so saw military service as a way to improve his own social status and economic well-being. He'd also married well. Martha Custis came from a wealthy family and really helped Washington become a wealthy plantation owner. Washington had been a land surveyor because he'd inherited no wealth but family connections. He was able to work as a land surveyor to be rewarded in land grants by the people he was surveying it for, the large plantation class, the planter class in Virginia. And by selling land, he was able to, and cherry picking land, he was able to build up his own private land holdings, buy slaves, and become a wealthy planter. But in the 1750s, he was still an up-and-coming guy. He was still very much on the outs economically, but even though he's kind of on the edge of the upper class in Virginia society, he's still not wealthy. So he's a young militia lieutenant with ambitions. So Governor Dinwiddie sends Washington into the Ohio to find the Marquis de Caen, to deliver a letter to him, to order him out of the Ohio River Valley in the name of King George. Washington, with a handful of men and a couple of Indian scouts, in what would have been a really daunting task, because remember, there's no roads out there at the time. There's footpaths that the Indians use, but there's no road signs. How do you find some dude in the middle of the wilderness in the 1600s or 1700s, 1750s? So Washington is able to find the Marquis de Caen, who allows him to change into his dress uniform. They have dinner together. Washington delivers this letter to him, to the Marquis de Caen. The Marquis de Caen reads the letter after dinner and politely folds it up, hands it back to Washington, and says, "That's very nice, but I take my orders from the King of France, not the King of England, and my orders are to drive you English out of the Ohio. So see you later. You can leave tomorrow." So Washington returns back to Virginia. On the way back, though, he notes, because he's a land surveyor and he's been taking notes the whole time on the lands out in the Ohio, he notes that where the Monogash and Allegheny rivers come together, coming out of the Appalachians to form the Ohio River, that there's a peninsula in a broad valley that would serve as an ideal location for a fort to really control the entire river valley, because it's protected on two fronts by water. It's on a little triangular piece of land. It can only be approached from the land by a narrow, from just one direction. And it's in a broad valley, so it's out of range of artillery from the highlands. It would really control and dominate the valley. So when he got back to Virginia, with the bad news that Marquis de Caen was not going to leave, he asked permission from Governor Dinwiddie to lead a military expedition to fortify this peninsula, to enable the English to drive the French out. So he got permission, and with a larger military expedition, Lieutenant Washington marched north into the Ohio to fortify the confluence of the Monogash Allegheny rivers that form the Ohio River. When he gets there, though, or gets near there, he finds that the French have already beaten him to the punch, that the French have already started to build a fort there, Fort Duquesne. Not only that, but they're sending scouts, an expedition out to see what Washington is doing in French claimed territory after they've already ordered him to leave. So what happens next is a little murky. According to the French and several of Washington's officers, Washington ambushed the French contingent and wiped them out, allowed his Indian allies to take trophies from the dead bodies of the French, to scalp them and cut their ears off. Washington then retreated and set up his own fort in a narrow valley and was quickly overwhelmed by the French and forced to sign a confession that he had treacherously and without cause ambushed this French contingent and wiped them all out, that he's in effect committed a war crime, because England and France were not at war. They were at peace. And so this taking a military action against the French would have been a war crime. So Washington then goes back to Virginia, humiliated. The confession he signs gets published in all of the colonial newspapers, and Washington resigns his commission in humiliation, not only because he'd been admitted to a war crime, but the newspaper editors are even harsher by saying his real crime is having lost to the French. Not having killed them, but having lost to them. So it's the second engagement that is even more humiliating for Washington. But he doesn't give up his ambitions. Because of this action, the English declare war on France. They send in a large regular English army to drive the French out under General Braddock. Washington sees an opportunity here and hires himself as a civilian contractor, what we would call a PMC today, private military contractor, to serve as a scout for General Braddock, since he had already been there and knew where the location was. So Washington served as Braddock's scout. However, Braddock disregarded Washington's advice. Washington advised that they circle to the north and attack from the north so that the French wouldn't be prepared for them, catch them by surprise. Braddock was convinced that the French didn't know he was there, and wanted to maintain the element of surprise by marching as quickly as possible on the French position and attacking them directly. The French, though, like the English, had Indian allies who had alerted the French to the presence of this large, lumbering English army, giving the French plenty of time to lay an ambush for the English army. And General Braddock was killed in the first exchange of gunfire as the French and their Indian allies fire on the English and their Indian allies, causing panic and disorder in the English ranks. Probably would have been a complete massacre, except Washington steps up. Washington takes command. Keep in mind, Washington's a civilian. Even if he was in the Virginia militia, though, he wouldn't have had the authority to command regular British troops. But just through his sheer commanding personality, he's tall, he's 6'2", at a time when the average height in the colonies was about 5'6". He takes command of the situation and organizes an orderly retreat. And even though it's a defeat for the English, Washington prevents them from all being massacred. As a result, his military reputation and career are rehabilitated. He re-enlists in the Virginia militia and serves honorably in the rest of the war. All right, I'm going to link a video to the rest of the French and Indian War to kind of finish that up, go into a little bit more detail about that, and how ultimately it becomes a world war, a global war, and the English end up victorious by 1763. The English are victorious. They control all of not only all of France's colonies in North America, they also seize Spanish Florida. So they control all of what's now Canada, and claim all of Canada to the Pacific, and all of France's colonies to the Mississippi, and all of Spain's colonies to the Gulf of Mexico, greatly expanding the English Empire. And that creates a sense of nationalism, right? That all of these colonies have participated in these wars, particularly the French and Indian War, which they lose. The English and their colonies lose badly in the first years of the war. Benjamin Franklin drafts the Albany Plan as a plan to unify the colonies. Ultimately, it's rejected. But the English are ultimately victorious and seize French Canada. So wars unify people against a common enemy, and when you win, it creates a lot of patriotism and pride, right? That no matter your ancestry, if you're German or Scotch-Irish or English or Welsh, you're proud to be part of the English Empire that has just decisively defeated the superpowers of both France and Spain. All right, finishing this up, religion. So this happens, the Great Awakening, often called the First Great Awakening, but like World War I at the time, they didn't know there'd be a second one. So they just called it the Great Awakening at the time. This happens in England and its colonies in North America at the same time. So for example, John Wesleyan in England establishes the Methodist movement. What drives this is a decline in church attendance. That fewer and fewer people are going to church. And that leads to this sense of, of crisis amongst religious leaders that people are losing their faith. So preachers like Jonathan Edwards, Wesleyan in England, adopt a much more emotional style of preaching, what we would now call fire and brimstone. Or Bible thumping, right? banging on the pulpit, banging on the Bible, waving it in the air, right? Repent or you're going to hell. Fire and brimstone to motivate and get people excited. Jonathan Edwards is the rock star of this movement in North America. At the time, this is going to be a popular movement in the North American colonies, akin to Beatlemania in the United States in the 1960s. Just this, Edwards in particular, like the Beatles, draws sellout crowds wherever he travels. The churches are packed to overflowing. People are just outside of the churches trying to listen in. He holds outdoor sermons in farm fields to address larger crowds. This much more emotional brand of preaching. And the printing press is going to convey a lot of these. Even if you don't see one of Jonathan Edwards' sermons, printing presses deliver those sermons in the newspapers. And remember, reading at this time is a social activity, something I didn't talk about with the process of Anglicization. It's something to keep in mind when we get to the Enlightenment. That most people, even though the printing press lowered the cost of books and other written materials, paper itself was still relatively expensive until the middle of the 19th century. It's not really until the middle of the 19th century, with a revolution in mass-producing pulp paper, that the average person can afford to buy books or newspapers. Even newspapers were beyond the means of most Americans to buy on a daily basis. So most people would read as a social activity. You would pool your resources. You and your friends would pitch in, buy a newspaper, and take turns reading it at the local tavern. Oftentimes taverns served as kind of the unofficial town hall where people would gather, read the newspaper together, and discuss current events. So before the days of Facebook, people got together at the tavern and talked about all the stuff you talk about on Facebook or Twitter, and you'd have a conversation. So when you read Thomas Paine's Common Sense, or I should say when you read it, you probably notice that some of what he writes is in all caps. He meant for that to be yelled. He knew when he published Common Sense that people would be reading his stuff aloud to each other. So reading newspapers and books, but particularly reading books, reading newspapers was a social activity. That's going to be one of the things that contributes to this common sense of identity. And one of the main topics in the middle of the 1700s is going to be the Great Awakening, this big religious revival movement. Again, the most recent thing I can compare it to really is the Beatlemania in the 1960s and how the excited people were about that and going to Beatles concerts, right? People would go to sermons by preachers like Jonathan Edwards like they would to big rock concerts today. And his sermons are going to be published. Benjamin Franklin publishes many of Jonathan Edwards' sermons, just like he publishes ideas of the Enlightenment. And this is going to be a common thing people discuss. So again, whether or not you're in Georgia or North Carolina or New England or Pennsylvania or Virginia, you're going to be able to read some of these sermons by prominent preachers like Jonathan Edwards, and you're going to be able to debate their ideas, and that's going to be a common identity that everybody has. Another thing that this is going to lead to then, not just common identity through this shared cultural phenomena, but also religious diversity. It's going to lead to creation of new Protestant faiths, but also the spread of existing Protestant faiths. Jonathan Edwards is a Calvinist, a Congregationalist, a Puritan, and that's going to lead to conversions in many areas outside of New England, and the spread of Calvinism in areas, particularly in the backcountry. Also, the American Baptist movement. Remember, Roger Williams, the founder of the American Baptist Church in Rhode Island in the 1630s. The Baptist movement got its start in New England as an offshoot of the Congregationalist movement. American Baptist movement becomes particularly strong and gains lots of converts in the Low Countries, in North Carolina and Georgia, and into the backcountry. So there's going to be a lot of increased religious diversity to go along with the existing diversity in a lot of the colonies. This is going to be one of the things that leads to increasing calls for separation of church and state during and after the Revolution. All right, so that finishes up this creating a common Anglo-American identity. Or the other big thing then is going to be the Enlightenment. Benjamin Franklin publishes a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment in his publications, and like the Great Awakening, that's going to be a common cultural trend that people participate in, shared ideas that bring them together. And I've got a whole separate lecture on that, and that's going to really provide the intellectual framework for the American Revolution. All right, thanks a lot. Hopefully next time I see you, I'll actually be seeing you, because I'm not seeing you, I'm seeing my camera. I'll talk to you all next week. It's already starting to warm up. Looking forward to seeing you face to face.